we're just a couple of minutes past. Thanks, Lizzie. So we'll get going. Thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to tonight's webinar. We're very excited to have you all here. Liz, could we have the first slide? Let's just move on to the first slide. So tonight's webinar is a joint webinar between the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research, the FPWR and the PWSA. So we have come together and we're working together on clinical trials. And we want to just let you know that why this is important. We really want to make sure that communities, from whether you're part of the FPWR or the PWSA, that you know about clinical trials that are coming up in the UK. So we really want to make sure everyone knows about trials, and we also, importantly, want to make sure that we support the pharmaceutical companies who are doing the trials. So we have come together for this webinar and to work on trials together. So next slide list, please.
Sorry, I am clicking it, but it's not changing.
It's just having a little bit of a
There we are.
Oh, brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you. So as we said, this is the first webinar, and we're planning on doing a series of webinars on clinical trials. And so please sign up for the next one, which is on the 9th of September. Today, we're going to give you a bit of a foundation in what is a clinical trial. And then in September, you'll get to hear from pharmaceutical companies themselves who are bringing trials to the UK. So you'll get to listen to find out a bit more about the trials that are coming over here from the pharma companies themselves. So that's going to be a really great webinar. So do join. We'll send out information on it nearer the time. And then there'll be subsequent webinars after that as well. So let's get cracking on tonight's webinar. So if we can just move on. So tonight's webinar is what are clinical trials and why do they matter to our PWS community? And tonight I'll be one of the speakers alongside Robin. So I work with the FPWR and Robin works with the PWSA. I do work, I'm fortunate enough to work in clinical trials, and I have done for 8 years. I love this industry. It's an amazing industry to work in. And I also have a little son, Thomas, who's 7, and he has PWS. So yeah, just great to be here and great to take you through what a clinical trial is. So Robin's going to join us shortly, and he will do an introduction as soon as he does. So let's carry on. So tonight we're going to cover what a clinical trial actually is. Let's demystify it. We're going to talk about why it's important to PWS families. What actually happens if you take part in a clinical trial, what actually happens, so you can see what it's like, and then help you understand if you should take part in a clinical trial. One of the questions we get asked a lot is why they take so long. We always get asked that question, so we want to cover that. And then lastly, but very importantly, is what trials are actually coming to the UK. So we'll come on to that at the end. So that's what we're going to cover. So first off, really importantly, what is a clinical trial? So a clinical trial's job is to really evaluate if a drug is safe and effective. So the top priority for any pharmaceutical company who runs trials is safety. That is their #1 priority. And what they want to do is find out if their drug works, if it's effective. So clinical trials are a test to see whether treatment works for a particular group of patients. So the group of patients might be PWS patients, they might be cancer patients, asthma patients, and so on. And what we do is we evaluate scientifically using lots of different types of tests. They might be cardiac tests, respiratory tests, whatever. We test scientifically if a drug works or not. And then the trial is designed to really minimize risk. We want trials to be very safe to take part in. And as I said, that's the top priority of pharmaceutical companies. And we want to reduce human bias. So we want decisions on whether a drug works to be based on data and not be influenced by bias. And then we're going to take you through the different phases of a clinical trial, all the way through to when it actually gets to a regulator. And the regulators are really important because they decide whether the drug is safe and effective independently. And then it hopefully will get approved for use on the NHS. So let's carry on. Why are clinical trials important? So if you think about your medicine cabinet at home, you open up your medicine cabinet, you might have Calpol in there. I've got plenty of Calpol. Ibuprofen, you've probably got some hay fever tablets, whatever. Every single medicine in your cabinet is only there because it's been through a clinical trial and it's been tested for safety and efficacy. So that's really important to remember. And we have several trials at the moment that are ongoing for PWS. And for example, the trials might look to see whether a drug helps reduce a person's hunger, or the trial might look to see whether it helps them be less tired during the day. There's a drug at the moment that we'll come on to that its aim is to reduce excessive daytime sleepiness. Or the drug might be trying to help improve behavior. So there are lots of different reasons why we do trials. And the pharmaceutical companies are very clear about what they want to test it for. And, you know, we all believe, you know, everybody in the clinical trial industry, we want to bring life-changing treatments to people who need them. And, you know, what we really want is new treatments for PWS. So let's find out a bit more. Okay, so when we look at a trial, we look at it from different angles. So a pharmaceutical company will decide who they want to they've got a drug and they look at which population they want to test the drug on. So do they want to test the drug on people with PWS? It might be that their drug is targeting cancer patients, for example, so that might be the population. And they might be just looking at adults, or they might just be looking at children. So they look at the population that they want to target. And then they look at what the treatment is. Is it a drug that they're testing, or is it a new medical device that they're testing? So if you think about a pacemaker or something, or an actigraphy watch to test how patients' mobility is. So there can be drugs that you test, or there can be devices that you test, for example. And then you often have what we call a control group. So, you know, sometimes patients will be given what we call a placebo drug. So it's not the real drug, but we compare it to the effect it has on people who've been given the actual drug itself. So we can do a control comparison to see whether the drug works. And then the outcome. So what outcome do you want from this trial? Do you want to reduce the how hungry people are with PWS? Do you want to reduce them being tired during the daytime? So that's what we call an outcome. And then obviously we measure it on certain criteria to know whether it actually succeeds or whether it's not working. And also what we look at is whether results are statistically significant. And that's a phrase we use a lot in clinical trials. So we want to make sure that that drug works. And that's what the regulators look for as well. They want to make sure that the drug actually really does have an impact. There's no point in having a drug for PWS that doesn't work. So we don't want it to go through all of these phases for it to be approved, and then it doesn't really have much effect. So we want to make sure it has statistically significant results as well. Okay. All right, I love this one. So this is our quiz time. So I want everyone to have a go on the chat. So clinical trials. When do we think the first clinical trial was? We're just going to take a bit of a step back, have a look at when they first started, put some guesses in the chat for me, or come off mute and shout out some ones here. I'm just trying to see if I can see the chat. I don't know that I can. If anyone wants to come off mute and just give a stab at how old they think clinical trials are. Any brave people? Okay. So let's have a look. Oh, 1890. Excellent. Good call out, Evelyn. Anybody else? Right, here we go. So the first actual clinical trial was done way back in 1747 by a chap called James Lind. He was the Surgeon General in the British Navy. And he had a hypothesis. And he thought, I can help prevent scurvy on ships. So he did the very first clinical trial. And he separated out sailors on the ship into 3 groups or cohorts. And he gave one group lemons one group's oranges, and the third group nothing at all. And the group that didn't have anything went on to develop scurvy. So this was his first test, right? And back in those days, they didn't have medicines like we do today. So what did James Lind do from this? So what he did is, sailors back then were in part paid with gin. So they were paid with gin, and they had, tonic and quinine in there to help prevent malaria. And then they put lime in. So a fantastic drink that did a lot of good stuff. And it helped prevent scurvy. And they used limes just because they were cheaper than lemons and oranges back then. But, and that's why we call our sailors limeys. So that was one of the first clinical trials. So there we go. I don't know if anybody got that answer right, but hopefully you got close. Okie dokie. So jumping back to today, this chart here shows the journey of a drug. Okay, this is a drug's journey right from the very start of the trial process through to when it gets approved. And it's a very long journey. So if we think about at the very start on the left-hand side, you might have, say, 5,000 to 10,000 compounds that are being tested in a lab. And then out of those 5,000 to 10,000 compounds, only 250 will make it through to a preclinical stage. So only 250 compounds out of those 5,000 to 10,000 they think has promise. So they'll bring those into what we call preclinical stage. And that's where you do the animal testing. And this is a really important stage because you want to make sure that those 250 drugs, compounds are safe. And safety is paramount in clinical trials. So they will make sure they are safe because when they come in to be tested on people and humans, we want to make sure they're going to be safe, okay? And that whole period is 3 to 6 years on average to do that. So it's quite a long time. And then 250 drugs in preclinical, only 5 will make it through to the actual human trials. So you can see that kind of rate, that figure really decreasing. And there is a high failure rate in trials. I mean, that is the reality. A lot of drugs fail. And you can see how they kind of dwindle here. So 5 drugs reach this middle section, and this middle section is the bit that we're interested in for Prader-Willi syndrome for other people as well, because phases 1, 2, and 3 are the bit part of a trial when they're tested on people, on humans. So this is the bit that we want to know about, and we'll go on to what the different phases are in a minute. But this middle section can last 6 to 7 years on average. So again, that seems like a long period, but for some drugs, like Alzheimer's drugs, that can be longer. It can be 10 years. There were 2 recent Alzheimer's breakthrough drugs last year, and phases 1 to 3 took 10 years because Alzheimer's progresses slowly, and the drug, you need a long period of time to see if the drug for Alzheimer's works. So we've taken 6 or 7 years in phases 1 to 3, when they're tested on humans. And after each phase, if the drug is shown to be safe and effective, it will pass through to the next phase. So a pharmaceutical company will do a phase 1 trial, and if the results that they're seeing are positive in terms of safety and efficacy, if they get funding, they will move it on to the next phase 2. And the same happens again. They carry on testing for safety, and they carry on testing for efficacy in patients. And then again, if the drug's shown to be safe and effective, it will go to phase 3. And then if the results are still positive, they will put the drug in for approval to the country regulator. And in the UK, the regulator is called the MHRA. So in America, on here on the slide, I couldn't change it to the FDA, but what we need to remember is the MHRA. That's our UK regulator, and it's their job to independently verify if they feel a drug is safe and effective. So they'll take all the data from the pharmaceutical company, and they will do their own analysis, and they may well go backwards and forwards with questions as well. So the regulator can take up to 2 years to decide on the drug. It can be as little as half a year. Just depends. So that's what we're interested in. So it's a long period, is what we're saying, but there's a reason for that. So if we can go to the next slide, then we'll we'll take a look at this. So on average, a drug from initial concept stage all the way through to approval takes 10 to 14 years. And that is a long time. But the good news for us is that certain drugs or for certain disease areas or indications, that can be faster. So for some cancer drugs, for example, rare diseases like PWS, trials can be shorter than that. So that's some good news. And if we can go to the next one. The big question, why do trials take so long? A few different reasons. And again, we're always going to come back to safety and efficacy. So the pharmaceutical companies need to make sure that their drug is safe for the people who it's being tested on. And if it gets approved, they need to make sure that it can be safe for them to take. And they need to make sure it's effective. And again, remember, like we said, for Alzheimer's, sometimes a disease progresses only slowly. And so you need to give the drugs time to show that they're making a good impact, a positive impact. And the second bullet point is something that people don't always think about, is funding. In the clinical trial space, you have got thousands of pharmaceutical companies around the world. And you've got some very small ones that you call biotechs, and they might only have one compound or one drug that they're trialing. And they rely on funding. So if they get paid by when they reach milestones. So if they get through phase 1 and they show positive results in phase 1, they have to secure funding often. Otherwise, they can't go into the next phase. If they don't secure that funding, they can't go to the next phase. So sometimes, trials can take long because they need to wait on funding to progress to the next stages. And at the end of phase 2, they probably then have to secure more funding to go on to phase 3 and so on. And there are some big pharmaceutical companies like AstraZeneca that you might have heard of, or Pfizer, and they are much larger pharmaceutical companies who will have a lot of drugs that they're trialing all of. So it's a big space. Recruitment is another reason why things take so long. And this is a big challenge. If you ask a pharma company, what's your #1 challenge? They will say recruitment every time. It's been well documented. They struggle to get enough volunteers for trials, which means trials are delayed or they don't move forwards at all. Sometimes trials are cancelled because there aren't enough people volunteering for it. Sometimes people just don't know about trials. And you can imagine that if you don't get enough volunteers, say there's a drug coming to the UK for PWS, and the pharmaceutical company can't recruit enough people, it will then likely have to look to other countries like France or Germany or Italy or something like that. And if they have to set up trials in those other countries, they've got to train sites, they've got to translate materials, they've got to get devices there for the trials. So, it all causes delays in the trial. And then you have to get approval from the regulatory authority, like the MHRA that we talked about, which can take half a year, 2 years. And then after that, you then have to get it approved by the health authority. So in England, the health authority is NICE. In Scotland, it's the Scottish Medical Consortium. And then there's one for Wales and Northern Ireland as well. So they, again, independently verify the data. So again, that takes time. So clinical trials aren't fast, but there's lots of reasons for that. So, yep, next slide, it's great. Good, so volunteering. I think we all know why volunteering is important from what I've just said. We can't do trials unless people volunteer. And, we wouldn't have growth hormones today unless people like ourselves volunteered 20, 30 years ago. So we are incredibly grateful to those people who volunteered 20 years ago to trial growth hormones. But what I would say is that we're in a really unique position today because we have trials on the horizon for Prader-Willi syndrome, and we do have that chance again to volunteer for these trials, and we'll come on to them a bit more in a minute. So taking part in research, we will beat Prader-Willi syndrome. There is a lot going on in terms of research, so yeah, it's an exciting time. Okay, Should we go? I don't know whether Robin's here yet. Yeah, I think Robin's just dialing in. Okay, so I'll take you through this slide, and then if Robin's here, then I'll pass over to Robin in a minute to carry on through some of the other ones. So on the graph that we showed earlier, the diagram of the journey of a drug, there was that middle section, phases 1 to 3, that I talked about. So this is it in a bit more detail, because this is the bit, again, that we're interested in. So phase one is a small phase, and a drug is usually tested in people that we call healthy volunteers. And these are people who tend not to have the actual medical condition, so people without Prader-Willi syndrome. And what we're trying to do in phase 1 is to make sure that that drug is safe. Okay, so we'll test a drug on 20 to 80 people, depending on the drug, depending on the disease, to just evaluate its safety. We've already looked at it in preclinical, but we want to make sure in healthy volunteers that it's safe. And also what we do at that stage in phase 1 is determine what dose levels are going to be the optimal dose levels as well. So that when we go into phase 2, if we've had positive results from phase 1, that is, when we go into phase 2, we actually trial the drug on people with the condition. So people with Prader-Willi syndrome, for example. And usually there's about 100 to 300 people take part in a phase 2 trial. When it's a rare disease or orphan drug, it tends to be a lot fewer people. And the reason for that is because there are a lot fewer people in that pool to take part in the trial. And at phase 2, we carry on looking at safety, always safety, but we're there to test effectiveness as well. Does it work? Does it do what we want it to do? Okay, so that's what phase 2 is designed to do, to test its efficacy. And again, if those results carry on being positive, then a pharmaceutical company may move it into phase 3. And phase 3 is a really big phase. Okay, it's a really important phase, because this is when they test the drug on a large number of people, patients or participants, and they really want to confirm the safety, and they want to confirm the efficacy in a large number of people. And you're going to have thousands of people in a phase 3 trial. Okay, so vaccines trials are typically extremely large. Other trials can be a lot smaller. But for rare diseases, for orphan drugs, a phase 3 trial might only be 50 to 150 people. So those are the phases that we're interested in. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. I don't know, Robin, what's the next slide? Let's just see what the next slide is. Okay, Robin, can I hand over to you to introduce yourself and take these slides?
Great, thank you very much, Helen. I'm Robin. I'm one of the Prader-Willi dads to my 14-year-old son, Clive, and I've been working with PWS UK in the Research and Medical Advisory Committee, and more latterly in a joint effort with FPWR. So I'm really pleased to give you part of this talk, and I'll try and explore some of the finer concepts which sometimes cause a bit of confusion. So leading on from Helen's excellent introduction to clinical trials and the stages of clinical trial development, I'll just give a quick word about why trial sizes are the size they are and why they're different in Prader-Willi syndrome. And you may remember that Helen went back to a concept where she talked about the outcome measure, and that is the pre-specified measure of whether your trial treatment or your trial behavior therapy or your trial device works and is effective. And depending on what you're looking for and how easy it is to distinguish an effective treatment from a non-effective treatment determines how big your trial needs to be. So as an analogy, if you were inventing a new kind of parachute compared to the standard parachute, to see whether it works or not, as in somebody who jumps out of the plane survives or doesn't survive, because the actual effect or treatment effect you're looking for is very large, it's either a yes or a no answer, you need a small trial. And in this, you could probably do a trial with 2 people in the trial doing 2 different parachutes, and you'd come up with an answer. When you look at a trial, something more subtle in the next slide, let's say you're looking at a group of marathoners who are looking to see if a particular type of trainer shoe is better than another. So one group wears Nikes and another group, let's say, wears Reeboks. And because the actual difference between the two shoes in terms of performance is probably likely to be very small or subtle, you need a large number of participants to actually tease out the difference, taking into account for some of the variability in each of the participants. So some participants may be professional runners, other participants may be long or short, the long stride. And again, when the difference that you're looking for is actually very small, then the trial size has to be larger to be able to distinguish that difference. Can I just check who's controlling the slides, if you don't mind? Thank you. Great. So in the example where you're looking to distinguish whether one trainer design is better than another trainer design in terms of finishing times, you'll end up needing a very large trial. And in this sense, in this example, you might need 2, 3, 4,000 or more participants to be able to show a difference that is statistically meaningful. Now, if we go on to the next slide and talk about what happens in Prader-Willi syndrome, well, Prader-Willi syndrome, by definition, is a rare orphan disease. And by rare, it's defined as something that happens in less than 1 in 1,000 people. And we know that Prader-Willi syndrome happens in around 1 in 20,000 to 1 in 30,000 births. And in terms of defining what an orphan disease is, this means that there is no effective treatment for the chronic condition. And we know that although growth hormone helps, we know that lots of our behavioral interventions help. We don't yet have an effective treatment to manage that cardinal syndrome, the defining problem of food-seeking behavior and weight gain in Prader-Willi. And when you look at designing a trial for Prader-Willi syndrome, whether that's a behavioral treatment or a medical device or a new drug treatment, you're looking for a difference in scores that quantify food-seeking or hyperphagia. If you were to define a trial that looks for weight gain, you might have a different calculation for the size of the trial. And if you were ever to design a trial for what drug or treatment makes Prader people live longer, you need a trial that would be thousands of patients. So in a rare orphan disease, you're trying to find a balance between an outcome that's meaningful, an outcome that is practical, against a population that is small. So this is why Prader-Willi trials tend to be about an order of 10 smaller than some of the larger drug trials for treatments for blood pressure or diabetes. So a Prader-Willi trial might be 10 or 20 patients in phase 1 or 2, growing to about 50, 100 or 150 patients in phase 3. So again, it's a balance of finding enough recruited participants for a rare disease, but also balanced against finding a meaningful outcome measure to show that your proposed treatment is effective. But the bad news is, although we seem to be entering something of a golden age of Prader-Willi trials, trials do get cancelled. And as Helen alluded to earlier, some of these trials are not run by big pharmaceutical companies with infinite resources. So a big pharma company would be analogous to, say, a large car maker like Audi or BMW or Nissan versus a boutique car maker. And so when you are a small drug design company and you might have only 1 or 2 products in your what they call portfolio, you are, as Helen referred to earlier, dependent on stage-by-stage funding, depending on the milestones you reach as a company and the milestones you reach in the phases of your drug design. So if you don't reach the next phase of success, your funders, your venture capital funders, may well pull their funding. And so if trials cost 10, 20 million per phase, if you don't reach the next milestone, your money gets pulled. And as a small company, you don't have the resources to continue on a trial despite having potentially a good product if you can't meet the success measure that you set yourself in the original study. And so this is why some of the last studies in the last 5 years for Prader-Willi syndrome have got cancelled at the last minute. Several of these drug designs were promising, but they were owned by boutique small pharmaceutical companies who wouldn't have had the resources to carry on without stage-by-stage funding. So in the next slide, we'll have a look at what happens actually when you decide to participate in a trial. So in the first instance, you might be scoping the landscape, looking for what trials are out there and which trials might be meaningful for you as a Prader-Willi person or Prader-Willi family member. So for some families, we know that food seeking is the priority, and so you might be interested in a food seeking trial. Other families might have problems with daytime sleepiness, or some families may wonder about behavioral interventions that might improve the daily behavioral challenges that you face. So if you identify a trial that interests you and is relevant to you, that might happen through either social media or via FPWR or PWS UK. And then once you identify that, you want to find a site for a trial that's running in the UK that is practical for you in terms of distance, and where the trial design is practical for you in terms of. We know since COVID that many trial designs have been adapted to allow more remote collaboration. So not every trial requires 100% physical face-to-face site visits. Okay? Often you may have a few site visits, and in the interim, some of the other assessments can be done remotely. And so this makes participation easier, more practical, and more widely available. And once you go through the trial, you will have a set number of visits. Some investigations will need to be done, and then other measures such as questionnaires or other pre-specified items in the trial design. Once the trial has concluded, the trial data is then assessed via the investigator, typically published in a journal, and then it goes onward to the regulator for assessment for its effectiveness. And then in the UK, to each national regulator for assessment for authorization to prescribe to the general public in our NHS. And in the next slide, this is just a snapshot of what happens. So the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority is the UK regulator that spans across all 4 nations to assess any drug treatment or any medical device for human use to see that it's effective and that it's safe. Once the MHRA gives approval for a new treatment, whether it's a drug or a medical device, then the actual authorization for prescribing or for distribution of that treatment for a particular disease is handed and devolved to the 4 nation regulatory bodies. In England, it's NICE. In Scotland, it's the Scottish Medicines Consortium. Wales and Northern Ireland have their separate regulators. And often this is based on a combination of effectiveness, safety, as well as cost effectiveness, because as a national healthcare system, free at the point of usage, the idea is that new drugs or devices carry no or minimal cost, no more than the usual prescription drug or medication. One exception to all of this regulation are behavioral trials, because they fall under a different remit and are not regulated in the same way. Okay, back over to Helen.
Okay, thanks, Roman. So also what we want to bring up on the webinar is how our community can help bring new drugs to the UK. So when the pharmaceutical companies submit data to the regulators also want to hear from the PWS community. So our voice really matters. The regulators in the UK want to hear the challenges that we have with PWS. You know, what are the day-to-day challenges that we have? You know, what does it mean to us when, you know, there are family members are food seeking? when they're constantly hungry? What does that stop them doing? What challenges does it give us as their parents or caregivers? So they really want to hear and understand our challenges, because we have a huge unmet need in PWS, and that's important for them to hear, and they want to understand it. So, and they also want to understand people who took part in some of the trials. So, you know, for example, if you took part in the recent DCCR trial from Soleno Therapeutics, you know, your experience of that matters. And so again, that's important to the regulators. So what we're going to be doing over the coming months is, you know, asking for your input, and we would love to hear about your challenges with PWS, you know, whether that be from any angle. It doesn't have to be just hunger. We want it across all the different kind of areas that you have challenges with, because we have different trials testing different things. And if you took part in the DCCR trial as well, we'd really like to hear from you as well. So don't worry about this now. We'll do a shout out over the coming months, but we would love to have your to hear your voice. Thank you. Right, back to Robin, I think, for what trials are going on.
Thank you, Helen. So this is an exciting slide, and it tells us in the last 2 years, we've had a great buildup of trials for Prader-Willi syndrome. And this slide basically tells us that we've got around 12 trials running around the world for various drug treatments for Prader-Willi syndrome. And if you look here, some of these are quite familiar to many of us. There's the carbetocin trial by Acadia. There's the DCCR trial by Soleno. And there are some new trials coming. Pitolisant, which is the wakefulness trial. There is the VNS trial, which is the vagal nerve stimulator device trial by FPWR USA. And there are other variants of different drug compounds that may show promise in Prader-Willi syndrome. And so you might ask, well, that's fine that there's a large global push for Prader-Willi syndrome treatment trials. What about in the UK? And we'll be talking about what's coming up in September, but our next slide gives us a small preview. So this slide gives us an overview of 4 trials that are in development or close to recruitment in the UK. And we'll tell you more about this in September when our next trial webinar happens. What you can see is that the carbetocin trial is recruiting around 170 families all over the world. And in the study, we're going to see whether a nasal spray for carbetocin with placebo inhaled through the nose 3 times a day is effective in improving symptoms in Prader-Willi syndrome. They are looking for Prader-Willi people aged 5 to 30 who have increased appetite behaviors and live with a carer or someone who can attend the study with the participant to record some of the caregiver outcomes. In order to be eligible, you have to have not used oxytocin, which is a derivative of carbetocin before, or other similar hormones like desmopressin or tizofenbazine within the last 6 months. There are other tests during the trial, which are related to medical investigations and other factors. There are other studies here that we can go into some detail. There is a new drug proposed by Aardvark, which is a first-in-class, what they call bitter taste receptor agonist. And the idea is whether this can reduce hyperphagia as a phase 2 or 3 study. And again, the third of the trials coming here is the Pitolisant trial, which is a study of daytime sleepiness or wakefulness. So we're hoping in September, when we come back to you for part 2 of our webinar together, that we will have the drug and trial sponsors talk directly to our audience about these exciting trials.
Thanks, Robin. So I know we're coming up on time nearly already. But what we wanted to really cover as well is how do you decide which trial is right for you? And really, both the PWR and PWS are here to help you. So if you're unsure, give us a call. We can help give you guidance on this. But Liz, if you go to the next slide, we've got a few pointers to start you off. So what we would say is take a look at the trials which are coming up in the UK, the ones that Robin just looked at, just put on his slide. They will be on the PWS Stronger Together website. Take a look at them. Which ones are important to you? So is hunger your most important challenge, or is it excessive daytime sleepiness and so on? So decide which ones are most important for you. And then thirdly, what would be involved in taking part? I know Robin mentioned it earlier, but have a look at the information. Firstly, would you or your family member be eligible? You have to be in that age range, for example, or that we talked about. So there's the eligibility criteria. And also, can you actually physically get to the sites, the clinical site? So I live around Nottingham. If there's a site up in Glasgow, that's going to be a long way. I can still go there. That doesn't stop me, enrolling in it and going to the Glasgow site. But you need to understand where the sites are and can you make those visits? Because there may be, a few site visits needed within the space of say 12, 14, 16 weeks that the trial might be going on for. And also, can you actually complete the tasks, the acts of the trial? Sometimes you might be asked just to complete a daily diary, like a questionnaire on a drug. And if the drug trial goes on for, say, 14 weeks, can you commit to that as well? Would that be possible for you? So there's some things to think about when looking at trials. So next slide, please. So a bit of a summary on what we've talked about, because there's a lot of information here and we appreciate that. But clinical trials in summary look at whether a drug is safe and effective. Does it work? Is it safe? There are several drugs coming over here over the next couple of years, and we're going to keep you informed of them. Both the PWR and the PWSA are going to be talking about the trials. So there's going to be a lot out there for you to listen to on social or on the website. So you won't be able to not see the trials that are coming up. You might want to volunteer for the trial. And at the end of the trials, if the drug is safe and effective, the UK regulator will need to look at it independently to approve it, or they might not approve it. And if they do approve it, then the UK health authorities need to approve it as well before we can access it. So there are hurdles, but at least you understand the process, hopefully, now that a drug has to go through. And importantly, at the bottom is our experience of PWS, our community's experience of PWS, our challenges, our experiences of being on the trials. They're really important for the regulators to hear. So, please let us know when we ask, do a shout out for your experiences. Please do support it. It's really important. Okay. Is there another slide, Liz, or are we wrapping up here? Okay, so to finish up, because we are up on time, what I would say is I know there's been a lot of questions in the chat, and we will answer those. And we'll get back to you with the answers on those questions. We've also had questions in before the webinar that are at the end of the slide. So again, we will come back to you on all of these because we know they're important to you. As the final thing though, please sign up for our next webinar in September, because we are going to hear from those pharmaceutical companies who are bringing trials over to the UK. If you want to watch the webinar again from today, please do so. It's going to be on the PWS Stronger Together website, and I'm sure there'll be a link as well from both organisations' websites as well. So please take a look at them. But, from Robin and myself, we really wanted to thank you for joining today. We hope you got a lot out of it. We hope you understand now a bit more about the clinical trial space. But again, please reach out to either organisations with any other questions. But thank you again for your time today. And with that, we'll let you go. Thank you, everybody.